conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
And we're back, welcoming into the show our next guest. We have Grayson Massey, Western Region Director for Young Republicans. Young Republicans' website is yrnf.com, yrnf.com. Grayson, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me, Stacy.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So you have a unique perspective, at least coming from the political right side of the aisle, on climate change. Talk to us about the Prove It Act.
Yeah, I'll caveat this, Stacy. I look at it from being a young Republican. I look at things through a political lens. But in a nutshell, the Prove It Act would enable the Department of Energy to review how clean and efficient American manufacturing is vis-a-vis, some very heavy polluting, still industrializing countries like China and Russia. And so really what the act itself, it's being sponsored by Republican of North Dakota, Kevin Cramer, is to reinvigorate the American manufacturing base, which has just been decimated over the past 50 years by very cheap, low-cost, pollution-heavy industries. And so we want to essentially level the playing field by adding on a fee to goods that are being sold by countries like China and India to bring back American jobs and American manufacturing.
So that is a good thing. Anything that drives manufacturing back into this country and takes it away from our adversaries and levels things for Americans, especially since our first choice should be an American-made product. Let Americans decide what they would prefer to purchase as opposed to just deciding for us and offshoring the jobs. But there's something more to this, and you talk about the need for original climate change solutions. And so this is in an attempt to win younger voters. And this is one of those things where, then we get into a Charlie Brown dust ball over whether or not we are speaking the same language or we have the same meaning when we're going into this topic, climate change. It's like setting a fire in a room, bringing it up, because for some people it's like a religion, right? They worship the earth. They don't believe that humans have a right to be here. They want to see population reduction, not control, reduction. And they want to see Americans kind of roll back their standard of living to the Stone Age. Regular Americans, not the elites. They'll still have their gas stoves, but everybody else should roll their standard of living back to the Stone Age. And if old people die from exposure, that's just the cost of saving our planet. So explain to us what you mean about the original climate change solutions.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Stacy. I want to touch on this point about talking about climate change. When we talk about climate change, especially when we're talking about climate change to younger voters, really what we're talking about is when people talk about climate change, is really they're talking about energy, right? And they are so intrinsically tied to each other, because if without energy, there's really no conversation about climate change, right? As we provide resources, whether it be nuclear, solar, wind, gas, oil, whatever it may be, we're really just talking about energy at the end of the day. And so I think that's the right way that we frame it when we're talking to different young conservatives across the country. Really, as I mentioned when I first started, I look at this as a political issue, and I'm concerned, Stacy, because I see so many of my peers who are conservative in every sense of the word, but refuse to vote Republican at the end of the day because they feel like the GOP has missed the mark on this. And really, we need to bring them back into the fold. It's not going to be may not be an issue this election cycle that's going to tip the scales, right? But it is going to be an issue at some point. And I worry about being able to be considered a viable national party if we don't do something to address it now. I think China and Russia are going to be top issues that are going to be addressed by all the GOP presidential candidates this next cycle. But I worry about the impact that not talking about climate change and talking about energy development is going to have on young voters broadly. So the original climate solution, as I mentioned, is taking back American manufacturing, creating more American jobs, creating more American goods and services, specifically goods here in the United States. And we can do that by imposing fees on heavily pollution-driven economies that import low-cost goods and undercut American enterprise, countries like Russia and countries like China.
So those are great solutions, but talk to us about how to discuss this, because I think a lot of Republicans aren't talking about it because younger people aren't just in favor of doing something about climate change. Some of them have been radicalized. They've sang all the songs from kindergarten through 12th grade. They've recycled to within an inch of their life, and they're not normal about this. This is a subject where they'll literally talk about, people not having the right to have as many children, people deciding not to have children at all because of climate and taking care of the earth. So how do we discuss this without, number one, turning it into a religion, and number two, offending the people who are most interested in it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And again, I would bring it back to, we can talk about, the protecting the earth and not that those things are inherently bad, but really, again, we need to talk about, it's really about how do we move the economy forward? How do we balance economic growth and prosperity of our nation while at the same time, not drinking dirty water and breathing polluted air? And, it's really, we need to be pointing the fingers at foreign countries, because the United States, and this is the talking point that I always mention to my peers who might not see eye to eye with me on this, is the United States has some of the most regulatory heavy environmental restrictions of any country. And it's not our air that we're polluting. It's countries like China and Russia and India that are still industrializing that are the heavy polluters and the emitters. Those are the people we need to be pointing at and saying, you need to clean up your act, because here in the United States, relatively speaking, we have very clean and efficient production of energy relative to the rest of the world, relative to the rest of the developed and industrializing world. So I think that the way you frame it is, you talk, again, to bring it back to energy, talk about, what the United States is doing right and is being a leader on this issue. And that's really what this Prove It Act is all about, is being able to further identify and say, here's where the United States is performing well relative to the rest of the world, and why the United States should and can and will lead on this issue moving forward.
And I believe we are leading on it, but we have people within the borders of our country who really, they hate any kind of, I mean, it sounds strange to say, but they hate any kind of success on our part. So when we're net energy producers, or when we're doing, the right things on pretty much anything, and it's bringing wealth and prosperity to Americans, they're kind of like gritting their teeth and losing it. We could be doing a lot to export clean energy if we were given the opportunities, because we are leaders in that arena.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's the biggest travesty and tragedy of our time is that we can lead, and we have the resources available domestically to do that and to be a net energy exporter, as you mentioned. But and unfortunately, this is why I said, I come back to the political lens again, is every time that we lose a national election or a state election or even local cities and counties, it's all very important. We have bad public policy that's being enacted. It's restricting good energy production policy that would allow us to do that. And so part of what we're trying to champion as young conservatives is to say, and young Republicans, go out and preach and say, hey, this is how we can win. We can win on this issue. Young voters, there's a segment of the voters, as you mentioned, Stacy, that we're just not going to see eye to eye with. But there is a large pool of conservatives who should be voting Republican, and they're not, because they don't feel like the GOP has addressed the issue of climate. And we feel like this is a chance for us to tap into that voter segment, and we can win with them, and we can win national, state, local elections with them on our side.
We can, and I want to have younger voters, because when you talk about them being conservative, when you talk about them, these are great people. We need them on our side, not in that team paradigm, but in the paradigm that if we don't have these good people understanding what our positions are, then we end up with, it's almost crazy how bad things are under Biden. And who propelled him into the White House? Well, it was young people.
Yeah, you look at my age range of I'm 29, and so you look at the voting block between 18 to 30, heck, even 18 to 25, and vastly leans or votes Democrat. But I'll tell you, in talking with many of my peers, that they have very conservative ideals, especially as they especially as they move farther into that later segment of their late 20s, and they start having to realize the economic consequences of some of the bad policy decisions that are being handed down from the top up, or from the bottom, from the top down. And so over time, they've come to realize, like, this is not all that it was chalked up to be. And we really need to be addressing issues that they do care about. Climate change is one of those, right? Energy production is one of those. They're intrinsically tied. We have to talk about it as a party. I know it may make some of us uncomfortable, but again, I would encourage, when we talk about climate change, we got to talk about energy. We've got to talk about how we're going to propel our country and our economy forward for the next several hundred years. And that's all about energy production.
It is. We can't leave it in the ground. We got to pull it up and keep the thing moving. And there are advances in energy, mainly in the nuclear sector, where we could be having even more success. But the environmentalists are really hamstringing us. And if they're not stopping us with gas stoves or liquefied natural gas up out of the ground, or fracking, if they're not hitting us on logging, if they're not hitting us on any way that we can create products, goods, services, or energy, they're hitting us on that. And so it's like a whack-a-mole. We get one area, working again and banging on all cylinders, and then they come in hot someplace else. It's a full-time job. And imagine if there were just millions and millions more of them. Oh, wait, they're waiting in the wings because they've been taught since kindergarten that they need to recycle and not have light bulbs.
Yeah, it's a challenging issue. And it starts right here on our college campuses. It starts in high school, right? Especially, those are very pivotal times. Of course, along the way, like parents and upbringing, right? Schools, other institutions like church or sports teams, things like that, all have an impact. But really, it's a very critical point in high school, college years, and that's where we try and activate conservatives and bring them out to vote.
Well, that's exactly what we have to do. And I think you have at your organization kind of the linchpin, the future. You're on college campuses. You're the young Republicans. It's a great group of people. Every time I see the young Republicans, whether it's holding an event, holding a speaker, at CPAC, any place, I see you guys. I'm like, look at these guys. Like, here we have a young Republicans here in St. Louis. I'm like, look at these guys. So thank you for doing it, for having the organization, and for putting in the heavy lifting, because we need you guys. We need you to multiply and multiply and multiply, so that more people can understand that not only is it the right perspective, but we're having more fun over here. So, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, Grayson Massey, Western Region Director for Young Republicans. It's yrnf.com. Thank you for coming on the show. Talk to you soon. Great weekend.
Thank you, Stacy. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night. 866-957-2874. We'll be right back with more Stacy on the Right. Stay there.